The relentless Russian advances are only speeding up as the collapse of Pokrovsk continues, with day after day advances by the Russian forces. The Russians have managed to capture several fortified positions on the flank of the TO406 highway, which is one of the main supply lines leading into the city for the Russian forces, gaining full control over it, with additional advances within the residential area, and this comes just a day after additional advances within the Shakhtarsk district and the flanks of the city. The Russians are here bit by bit gaining full control over supply lines leading into the city, and with these recent advances at the start of this month, the stalemate over the fighting within the city has ended and the Russians are rapidly advancing. This is just one of the many areas of the front line where the Russians have managed to advance over the past 24 hours. The Russians are continuing their advances along the first line of defense in the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, to the south of Pokrovsk and in the northern flank, as they continue the offensive operations to capture the flanks of the operations in the north of the city in the direction of Dobropilya and isolating it from Kramatorsk. Russians also managed to advance in the south of Siversk and northwest of Liman, as well as within Kupiansk itself, strengthening the chokeholds they have on the Ukrainian forces within the city. The Russians also managed to advance within Vovchansk in the northern section of the front line. Starting out to the east of the first defensive line, the Russians managed to continue their advances to the east of Pokrovsk, gaining control over additional parts of the residential area east of the Yansha River. Russians also managed to control the first line here to the northwest of Olhivske in the vicinity of Okhotnichne, as well as to the northeast of Novovasilivske. The Russians continued offensive operations on the flank of the fortifications to the northeast of Novomykolaivka, as well as in the vicinity of Novovasilivske, in an attempt to gain control of the eastern residential area. The Russians have also managed to push in the vicinity of Okhotnichne, to push in the direction of all the residential areas east of the Yansha River, as they are storming them all simultaneously in the vicinity of Novovasilivske, Okhotnichne, and Poltavka along the river line. This is a combined effort by the Russian forces to not just push in the direction of Poltavka in the south of the defensive line, but also the fortifications and the residential areas east of the river line for additional crossings across the river line. This is a wide assault by the Russian forces to spread out the Ukrainian forces and weaken their defenses by widening the front line. Moving up north, we arrive at the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where the Russians have managed to gain control over the two defensive lines along the first lines here along the railway area. The railway area is now split between the northern and southern section, where Russians have control over the south and the Ukrainians of the north. This allows the first line to act as a physical barrier between the Russian and Ukrainian forces that covers the flank of the TO406 highway. This means the Ukrainians no longer have direct fire control over the area all the way to the last defensive line, which is located right here at the entrance to the city. The Russians are here working on both the eastern and western flanks of this last defensive line to flank the fortifications from the rear while applying pressure on the front. This is to put the Ukrainian fortifications in a pincer and storm it from its flank. Gaining control over the last defensive position will strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities to secure the entirety of the flank of the TO406 highway that acts as a logistical supply line for the Russian forces storming the city. Gaining control over this western TO406 highway acts as a parallel supply line at the magnitude of the E50 highway as for the Ukrainian forces, as it is literally a mirror between the two sides, with the railway and the highway covered in the north. The Russians are here threatening the E50 highway supply line by threatening the positions near the industrial area, storming it directly through the E50 highway itself up towards the industrial area, as well as storming the Ukrainian counterattack directly and again putting a pincer on the Ukrainian positions, gaining control over the residential area south of the railway line as well as the defensive positions along the entrance to the city, and then pushing up towards the E50 highway through the highway itself and through the railway section, the Russians are looking to physically gain control over the E50 highway and the industrial area in the northwestern parts of the city, which will allow the Russian forces to physically cut off the western road, while they are already threatening the supply in the northern road, which would put the Ukrainians in a position where the cities of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad are both operationally encircled. The Russians are now just days away from that happening. The Russians are not just storming the western parts of the city as well as the southern parts near the Shakhtarsky district, they are also working on the northern flank, where the Russians recently recaptured the fortifications on the vicinity of Pankivka and fully recaptured Novotoretsk. Now they are threatening the Ukrainian positions within Volodymyrivka by covering the western flank, which opens for a push towards the southern flank, similar to what we saw prior to the Ukrainian counterattack in the area, when they relocated a lot of their forces to launch counterattacks on the northern flank due to the Russian breakthrough of the front. Now what we're seeing is that the Russians are working on the supply line to the north, where there is this intersection to the south of Rodinsk, which if the Russians cut that off, they'll have control over the northern supply route, and the E50 highway intersection in the industrial area to the west will cut off the western highway, which leaves a wide area in between the first and second positions, which the Russians can have fire control over through artillery, FPV drones, and long-range strikes, which is the operational encirclement the Russians are looking for. If all of the Ukrainian supplies are centered around this small gap in the Russian positions, then the supply situation for the Ukrainians will reach a critical point where they'll not be able to properly resupply their forces, and their supply lines will be under constant threat by Russian forces. This means that it will only be a matter of time before the Russians gain control over Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Yet it's not just that, but also the fact that the Ukrainians will be taking a lot more losses with poor supplies than if they had proper supplies. That means the Russians gaining control over the intersection to the north and the intersection in the west will allow them to limit their own casualties and speed up the capture of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad while increasing the casualties of the Ukrainian forces defending both cities. Getting control over Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad is a complete game changer for the western parts of the Donetsk region, as it opens the road for the Russian forces to push in the direction of Dobropilya, and it also opens the road for Russian offensive operations into the eastern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Currently, the Ukrainian defenses within the Dnipropetrovsk region is centered around Novopavlivka as a logistical hub on the western flank of Pokrovsk. It will be spread across Myshova and Slovyanka following the Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, while the Russians will have Pokrovsk as their own logistical hub for offensive operations to threaten these three settlements, which completely switches the balance of logistics from an overwhelming Ukrainian advantage to a much more balanced level. On the southern flank of Siversk, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Kuzminivka, gaining control over the southern residential area. This leaves just the northern residential area and the trench lines on the vicinity of the settlement under Ukrainian control. The Russians here continue their positional fighting along the fortifications and the settlement areas to gain control over the road leading up to Siversk from the south. This is to cut off the southern supply route to Siversk near the intersection in the direction of Sviatopokrovsk. In the southern flank of Svenivka, positional fighting is also continuing as Russians are trying to improve their positions to not just gain control of the supply lines leading into Siversk, but also to spread out the Ukrainian forces as they currently concentrated on the northern flank to hold back the Russian breakthrough that managed to gain control over the northern fortifications, which, although the Russians have full control over the area, the Ukrainians still have the river line, which acts as a natural geographical barrier here to the northwest of Siversk, the Bakhmutovka River, leading up to Dronivka. In the northwest of Liman, the Russians continued offensive operations across the river line south of Chentriholovo in the northern flank of Novoselivka. The Russians are here securing the supply lines in the western flank of Chentriholovo to gain control over the forest patch areas and secure a proper foothold across the river line. This is as they continue their threats and storming of Novoselivka, as they continue offensive operations to gain control over the settlement, cutting the two supply lines leading into Liman from the northwest down to one. Further north in the Kupiansk direction, the Russians continue their battle over the city as they continue on the flanks of the apartment complex area in the southern parts of it. The Russians are here bypassing the residential area by pushing through the residential buildings on the flanks of the apartment complex area, gaining control over the road to the southwest, cutting off the main supply route, while also advancing in the vicinity of the southeastern road. This is to completely cut off all supply lines leading into the apartment complex area to begin the siege of it, gaining control over the southern apartment complex area while already sieging the northern and central areas, which is the northern apartment complex area and the central railway station area, which are both outposts and defensive positions for the Ukrainians, not to mention the school area and the fortified buildings here in the central eastern parts of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians have numerous positions which are all being squashed by the Russian attacks on the supply lines, leading the Ukrainian positions to be undersupplied. And if the battle drags on, the Ukrainian fortifications will weaken simply because they will not have enough supplies for the defense of the city. And again, this is another area where rather than the Russians being days away from operational encirclement of it, the Russians are days away from full control over the western parts of Kupiansk, which will completely switch the balance of power in this section of the front line in favor of the Russians, not just the logistics, but the fighting itself. As for the Vovchansk direction in the north, the Russians have managed to make several advances in the southern parts of the Vovcha river line as they continue offensive operations to gain full control over Vovchansk. The Russians here have managed to secure the industrial area across the river line in the northern parts of Vovchansk. This is allowing them to secure a proper foothold, but the Ukrainian positions here along the bridge here in between the northern and southern parts of Vovchansk still prevents additional supply lines from reaching into an area. The Russian main supply lines are currently pushing through from the Hatysha direction, where they're moving through the railway bridge and moving through some makeshift bridges across the Tversk River into the forest patch area in the western flank of Vovchansk, where the Russians have supply lines leading through mostly on foot. Now the Russians are pushing through Vovchansk itself while also pushing through the roads within the forest patch area, which allows them to move through with light vehicles to push in the flank of Vovchansk to cut off the supply lines from the western direction. Russians are slowly pushing through Vovchansk, gaining control over the town, which acts as a logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in the area. Beyond the Vovchansk, there's a far distance between that and the next logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces. This means that the logistical situation will yet again switch in favor of the Russians, similar to the Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad directions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.